Hello, I'm Connie Tremlett, and I'll be talking about seabird colony counts which were undertaken this year following the 2021-22 outbreak of highly pathogenic avian influenza. Linda Wilson is the project manager, while I coordinated surveys and am currently working on analysing the data. So firstly, a bit of context. The current strain of highly pathogenic avian influenza, or HPAI, was first recorded in UK seabirds in 2021 and has since gone on to have a devastating effect on an unprecedented scale, with widespread mass mortality and tens of thousands of dead seabirds recorded in Scotland alone in 2022. HPAI is a highly infectious virus, and colonial nesting seabirds are particularly vulnerable. Great skewer and gannet were two of the species most visibly affected by the initial outbreak, both species for which the UK population is of high international importance, with around 60% of the global total, though gulls, terns and guillemot were also particularly hit. Worryingly, for many species, the HPAI outbreak also comes on top of declines reported by the latest seabird census, which was completed just before the initial outbreak. The census reported that 14 Scottish seabird species had declined by over 10% since the previous census around 2 decades earlier, and for 7 of these species, numbers were down by over 50%. Though updated colony counts were urgently needed to better understand the impacts of HPAI on numbers of seabirds attempting to breed, many of the species affected by HPAI are also species that are high consent risk, as they're potentially impacted by offshore wind development. RSPB prioritised species for survey based on conservation and consenting risk, decided in conjunction with the Marine Directorate and other funders, and overall 14 species were prioritised for survey in Scotland, including several species that are high consent risk. Surveys were undertaken by a range of organisations and individuals at hundreds of sites across the country, and we then collated these counts and compared them to counts made before the outbreak of HPAI. I will now show you some preliminary results for gannet and great skewer. First up, the gannet, which was prioritised for both consenting and conservation risk. This map shows sites surveyed for gannet across the UK, both by RSPB and others. The colour of the circle shows the change between the baseline count, which was made before the outbreak of HPAI, and the 2023 count, with severe decline shown in red and moderate decline shown in pink. The size of the circle is proportional to the size of the colony in 2023. HPAIs that are designated for gannet are named on the map. Around 70% of the Scottish population held at the time of the latest census was counted in 2023. Now, overall, there was a decrease of over 20% in counts across all sites surveyed in Scotland. This follows from the previous period between the last two gannet censuses, where the population had increased by 40% in Scotland. And this also means that declines at many sites are actually likely to be worse than indicated, as the baseline count used to calculate population change was made anywhere up to 9 years ago, and at many sites the population should have been increasing in the meantime. The reversal of this positive trend and the high mortality observed at colonies indicates that HPAI is the likely cause of these recent decreases. Next, great skewer, one of the highest priority species in terms of conservation risk. These maps show sites surveyed for great skewer in Scotland, both by RSPB and others, with SPAs that are designated for great skewer named on the maps. Around 81% of the population held at the time of the latest census was counted in 2023. And overall numbers crashed, with great skewer showing by far the greatest reduction in overall counts recorded across all the species surveyed. There was a severe decline of over 50% at the majority of the sites surveyed, and you can see on the map the widespread severity by the profusion of red circles. Numbers were down by over 80% in the previous hotspots of Hoy and Hermanus. And this follows from the previous period between the last two censuses, where the great skewer population had increased by 14% in Scotland. And again, the high mortality observed and the huge decline in counts leaves little doubt that the population changes are a direct result of the HPAI outbreak. This work has provided updated population counts at key SPAs for high consent risk and conservation priority species. Counts were made at sites within 41 SPAs in Scotland. We only had time to present 2 species, but for example, this map showcases the wide survey coverage of guillemot count data from sites within 18 SPAs designated for the species in Scotland. These counts will improve the evidence base for habitat regulation assessments and conservation management, and they'll provide an updated baseline from which future HPAI and offshore wind impacts can be monitored. And data will be available to end users. Count data is already publicly available through the SMP database, which can be accessed through an online portal managed by the BTO. And the report will be published on the RSPB website early this year. This was a 1-year emergency project, but the threat from HPAI is ongoing. These counts were largely completed before the further outbreak of 2023, which caused further mass mortalities, particularly in small gulls, including kittiwake, terns and guillemot. So there's a need for continued monitoring of the numbers of breeding seabirds. There is also a need for longer-term research to understand potential sublethal effects of HPAI, for example on breeding success and the knock-on effects of large-scale, short-term recruitment of younger, inexperienced breeders. This project was a massive effort reflecting a huge amount of work across many organisations, and we are very grateful for all the support we received over the last year. So a huge thank you to everyone who has been involved. This work also would not have been possible without generous funding provided by multiple organisations, including ScotMER and others. And thank you for listening.
Hello, I'm going to present on the project commissioned by the Scottish Government assessing the feasibility of strategic ornithological compensatory measures in a Scottish context. So this is measures that could be used to compensate for the impacts of offshore wind farms on seabird populations. And the project was looking to assess which of the what potential measures could be helpful. And this is a project that I did closely with my RSPB colleague Claudia Tapia Harris. And I should say the presentation today is going to focus on the approach and the scope of the project and not the results, and also won't be able to answer questions on results today. So the objectives for the project was to review both the ecological and practical feasibility of various potential compensatory measures. And this was divided into 2 parts. The first work package focused on the ecological feasibility, which is essentially ultimately would a measure deliver a conservation benefit, a gain in productivity or survival for a seabird population. And the second part on practical feasibility, which is if it's ecologically feasible, how practical would it be to actually implement a measure on the ground, and how would one go about that? So the starting point for this project was a long list of measures, which is the table shown on the screen there, which was provided by the Scottish Government. So this project didn't start by evaluating kind of what measures to include. That was determined outside the project. And these originated either from a workshop held by the Scottish Government in 2022 or from a report by James Pearce-Higgins and colleagues completed for the MARPAN project. And these include kind of quite a diverse list of measures, for example, habitat management at terrestrial breeding colonies, bycatch mitigation, so reducing the incidental mortality of seabirds in fisheries, predator eradication, for example, removing rats from offshore islands, and managing supporting habitats at sea, for example, things that would boost kind of prey populations. So the project followed a sequence of steps. It started with this table which I mentioned with the compensatory measures, and then we evaluated for each of those what are the kind of specific conservation actions that you would actually do, and those are kind of what would be the subject of the ecological feasibility reviews, which I'll go into a bit more detail in a moment. And then we took a subset of those and evaluated the practical feasibility. So for the practical feasibility, that's the orange there, we identified the steps to implement the measure, and along with that, identifying the kind of barriers and potential risks to delivery, and where possible, identifying how those could be mitigated, and also evaluated the potential level of compensation that could be delivered. Then this fed into the final recommendations. For some of the measures in the original table, we could not directly identify specific conservation actions to be tested with the systematic literature reviews, so those were assessed separately, which I'll mention in a moment, which is the yellow on this diagram. So in this project, we distinguish between conservation actions from kind of wider compensation measures. And here we followed kind of international standard conservation terminology, with conservation actions defined as anything you might do to manage, protect, enhance or restore wildlife or ecosystems, and specific interventions to counter threats to biodiversity, take advantage of opportunities or restore degraded biodiversity targets. So for each of the original measures from the table, we sought to identify corresponding conservation actions. For some of these, this was straightforward, for example, sandal fishery closure, where the measure and the action is the same. For others, they represented a potential suite of actions, for example, habitat management at terrestrial breeding colonies, while some others did not readily kind of correspond to actions at all, for example, disease event mitigation. But once we've gone through all of that, we finalised the scope of the reviews that would be included in the project. So the top part of this table shows those that were considered via full ecological systematic reviews, and then the lower part of the table shows those that were considered by these separate scoping reviews, which sought to identify potential conservation actions that you could do under that topic. So for those measures that we evaluated using the ecological systematic reviews, each of these includes a chapter with an introduction and background to the ecological principles behind the measure and its associated conservation actions, and then a summary of the results of the systematic literature review, summarising the evidence available, the overall findings, and scoring of the ecological feasibility. So for the scoring, this figure shows a hypothetical example with two different studies, two different actions, a red action and a black action. And here you can see the red action scores highly for ecological efficacy, and the individual studies, which are the individual dots here, were also highly relevant. So the kind of composite score for that action would be somewhat higher than that for the black action in the lower left-hand corner. I mean, theoretically, you could get a case where you have an action where there's a lot of evidence which is very strong in terms of ecological efficacy, but the relevance is weak. So for example, they might have tested the action that you're interested in, but they studied it in a different species in a very different location. So then its transferability might be questionable. So in the second part of the project, we evaluated the practical feasibility. And each of these also follows a kind of chapter approach. So each chapter includes a high-level summary table highlighting the most important and relevant information, a background summarising key points of the measure based on the first work package, the ecological feasibility, the steps to implement the measure, ecological effects of implementing the action, focusing on the specific seabird species, monitoring and research recommendations, key considerations, identifying barriers and potential solutions to those, and identifying any species-specific aspects of implementation, and then overall conclusion. So we're now nearing the end of the project, with the draft final report under review by the steering group. We're then looking to finalise that report with revisions over the next month or so, and then it will be subsequently published. I'd like to thank the Scottish Government for funding the project, and the steering group for valuable input kind of throughout the project. And thank you for listening.
My name is Andy Blyth. I'm a Senior Consents Manager with Copenhagen Offshore Partners, and I'll be providing a short presentation on the work we've been involved with in developing compensation measures for ornithological interests that could be delivered at a regional scale. So this collaborative piece of work has been commissioned by 12 Scotland projects, all of which are at the early stages of development. The projects are likely to be both fixed and floating developments, and with a combined potential generating capacity of approximately 20 gigawatts. That's about 10 times that of the current generation from offshore wind farms in Scotland currently. It's likely that the first of these projects will submit their applications to Marine Directorate this summer. So the rationale for the work stemmed from the collective concerns amongst these projects on the requirement that individual projects may need to submit a derogation case alongside their applications. The likelihood for this is made apparent through the sectoral marine plan, what's happening south of the border in English waters, and of course more recently in Scotland with the Berwick Bank wind farm submission. It's therefore likely that as these projects submit their applications, they may also require a project level derogation case, and with it details of any potential compensation requirements. So the aims of the project were to identify compensation measures that could be delivered at a regional level for multiple projects being developed off the east and northeast coasts of Scotland. Whilst we've considered the closure of sand eel fishing and the closure of other fisheries as a viable option as delivering compensation, we haven't considered it in any detail within this assessment due to the mechanisms of implementation, e.g. being in control of the government. So the project is solely looking at any compensation requirements associated with the operation of the wind turbines. So really the impacts associated with collision and displacement on seabirds. It doesn't consider any other infrastructure, including the export cables. The project also focuses on the 5 key species that we know have the greatest likelihood of interaction with turbines in the North Sea. So that's kittiwake, puffin, guillemot, razorbill and gannet. An important aim of the project was also to ensure alignment with other similar scopes of work that are also underway by other parties, including the RSPB piece of work that you've just heard about. We're therefore very grateful to the Scottish Government and RSPB Scotland for having conversations with us throughout this project. So in terms of the methodology, we decided to take a robust yet pragmatic approach to the project, which meant that a high-level review of the existing literature on compensation for birds was carried out. This was used to provide the more extensive list of potential measures that were to be consulted upon. Workshops with a broad range of stakeholders, including Scottish Government, ornithologists and fishery experts, helped refine the long list to a more manageable short list. We believe these to be the most viable options for delivering regional scale compensation. Finally, a second workshop was held in mid-January to discuss these in more detail and to allow any further input before the finalisation of the report. This report should be available in the next couple of months. So as can be seen from this slide, we identified 19 potential measures within the long list. These measures were all subject to an expert judgment review by our consultants and covered a qualitative assessment on important attributes, including what evidence exists for the measures to have a positive effect? Could the measures be delivered at large scale, potentially compensating for all of our projects? Could the measures deliver compensation for species and at SPAs where potential adverse effects may be concluded? We also considered the time frames it may take for any measure to start making a difference to population growth, as of course this is key to understanding how long the measure may need to be in place to compensate against any assessed impacts. So each attribute was rated to determine those most likely to be viable at a regional scale for our projects and within acceptable timeframes, therefore creating the shortlist. Through the evaluation process, we identified 11 potential measures that made it onto the shortlist. Measures such as mammalian predator control and establishment of new nests were considered to have a high degree of certainty over the potential compensation offsetting, whereas other measures such as those habitat restoration ones are considered to have a far greater level of uncertainty. The project also tries to identify the potential scale of the problem associated with the development of these projects. So whilst this is all incredibly high level, we already know from previous submissions that adverse effects could be concluded on up to 11 SPAs, and it is likely that these projects could conclude similar conclusions on the same SPAs. It's also important to highlight that whilst these projects are generally a lot further from the coast and therefore less likely to have such high impacts on birds, the collective area for these projects is 2.5 times greater than those existing and proposed wind farms out with the Scotland leasing round. So the scale of impacts is potentially high. So whilst the report is being finalised, I still think it's fair to say that to deliver the pipeline of new offshore wind farm developments in the UK, that is likely that those non-like-for-like measures will be required. This is on the basis that those measures with greater evidence are taken up by those projects going through the consenting process first. It's also clear that there is potentially a lack of viable compensation measures, both where evidence and non-evidence exists, and for many of those measures it can potentially take a long time for the benefits to take effect. Therefore, in order to meet net zero, it's highly likely that a more holistic and strategic approach to delivering compensation will be required. This approach will maximise the efficacy of adopted measures, allowing for larger scale and more impactful measures to be realised. It will also maximise the benefits of the measures to vulnerable species and habitats. For the developers, it will help provide greater certainty over compensation deliverability, and it will also reduce competition over those best measures. From discussions that I've had through this process, it's also clear that an ecosystem approach to compensation measures that strengthens seabird resilience would likely have the greatest long-term benefit to vulnerable seabirds. It would therefore seem sensible that the Marine Recovery Fund and any Scottish equivalent could consider these types of measures as solutions to the complicated compensation conundrum. So as you've just seen, we're hoping to finalise the report in the next few months. The group of projects have also started discussing what the next collaborative next steps could be, including a work stream to consider in more detail our cumulative ornithological impacts, and this would be with the aim to help get a far greater handle on the scale of the potential issues as soon as possible. Finally, we've had a lot of positive discussion with the Scottish Government and DEFRA, and it would be hoped that we could carry on these discussions so that we can establish a practical compensation scheme that helps deliver net zero ambitions, as well as maximising the long-term benefit to seabirds and the wider ecosystem. Thank you for listening.
Hello everyone, I'm Adam Butler from BIOS, and I'll be talking today about the potential for the Cumulative Effects Framework, or CEF, to support and enhance the use of evidence in consenting. This was a project jointly funded by Scottish Government and the European Maritime and Fisheries Fund, and was a large consortium led by UKCH. The motivation for this project was that quantitative tools for seabirds and marine mammals have been developed for use within assessments, and a wide range of data relevant to these tools exist and feed into the assessment process. And the diagram here just shows sort of a short summary of the key tools that are currently used in assessments for seabirds, how those link together, and how those link to some of the key kinds of input data that are used. But the motivation for the CEF was a consensus that the way that tools are used, linked to each other, linked to data, and then reported within assessments needs greater transparency and consistency. So the main objective of the CEF was then to provide a new user-friendly platform for the implementation of standardised methods of assessment, which is then designed to try and facilitate reductions in the uncertainty in consenting and to speed up the timescales for consenting. The contract was funded by Scottish Government, developed under contract to Scottish Government, but in consultation with a wide range of stakeholders through an initial series of workshops and technical working groups. One of the key features of the SEF is it collates together existing relevant data into a data store, including metadata for that data, and that it links into existing assessment tools. So the SEF is primarily around providing a framework for linking together existing tools and data in order to quantify impacts, rather than collecting any new data or developing any fundamentally new tools. There's a particular focus in the SEF on estimation of cumulative effects, which in this context means in combination effects of multiple wind farms, hence the name of the SEF, but it also incorporates the facility to just estimate project-alone effects of a single wind farm. A key idea of the philosophy of the SEF is that the framework is flexible in the way that users can provide inputs, for example, to the SEF, and so the associated guidance from SNCBs on appropriate use of the SEF will be key to the way it should actually be used in assessments. So there's four main components to the SEF itself. One of these is the data library and data store that sit behind that, which are the data that underpin the SEF, and then the data library providing the public-facing access to that. There's a set of R packages that sit behind the SEF, and particularly an integrative R package for linking the different tools together and linking the tools to data. There's then a user interface, which is the way that users will interact with the SEF, and depending on the functionality they're using, the output from tools may just be then presented within the user interface if they're doing sensitivity mapping or working with marine mammals. But for other tools, the SEF then goes away and runs what's called the SEF engine behind the scenes, and then we'll email back a PDF of output reports to the user, which then provides an audit trail for how they've used the SEF. Just to give you a quick overview of what the SEF actually looks like, this is the first page of the user interface that people will see, and they'll then be walked through a structured set of inputs to provide, and the different pathways through the SEF will determine the inputs that people select. So people begin by deciding if it's marine mammals or seabirds they're going to focus on. I'll present seabirds here, but the basic structure is similar for marine mammals. They then select a species, and then that will determine subsequent options. The first set of questions people go through are all around leading up to selecting the tools that they're going to use, but that's through a series of selected structured questions to try and rule out sort of any selection of not reasonable combinations of tools. It will then confirm the tools people have selected and then go on to collect information on the populations people want to consider and also on the projects they want to consider, so the footprints, wind farm footprints. And there is also the functionality here for people to upload their own wind farm footprint if the wind farm they're interested in is not already in the SEF data store. Users will then provide a wide range of other information depending on which tools and forms of assessment they're considering. For example, things like population sizes, levels of apportioning from projects to SPAs. And once users have selected all of the relevant inputs, there'll then be a final step where the SEF shows all of the inputs and that each of them has been checked. Users have provided the valid values. It then runs some additional input checks, and it will then, where relevant, go off and fire up the SEF engine. That will go away and then produce a PDF report, which is then emailed back to users. And this again has quite a structured, standardized format. So this is the first page that people will see of that PDF. So that's a quick overview of what the SEF is and what the motivations behind it were. How then can the SEF be used to kind of support and enhance offshore wind assessments and thereby help the consenting process? Probably the main way is through the ability to reproduce usage of assessment tools and data by others, which then provides a way of assuring transparency and ensuring that each different stakeholders are aware of the way that other stakeholders have used the tools and data. A related application then is to quantitatively explore the assumptions that underpin the tools and the sensitivity of the SEF outputs to model inputs, allowing people to explore how varying assumptions will change the outputs. And this also then feeds into the third main sort of application, which is that the SEF provides a natural framework for propagating uncertainty between the tools, and so allows the potential for precaution to be interpreted in a more holistic way across the assessment process rather than separately for each tool or stage, and therefore allows for potentially new ways of interpreting precaution within the process. The modular structure of the SEF is hopefully useful in enabling data gaps, knowledge gaps, areas of ambiguity to be highlighted, and thereby to help in supporting prioritisation of future research. And then the final potential usage related to that is that the structure also then provides a mechanism to establish and operationalise a pathway to impact for future research, and that increases the potential for new models and data to be rapidly incorporated into the assessment process. Thank you very much for listening. If you have any questions, please get in contact with Jared, who's the lead at Scottish Government, Kate Sill, who's the project manager, or myself, leading on functionality. Thank you very much.